All right. Welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I'm Dr. Shaunna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And I am here with Dr. Lisa. How are you doing on this our anniversary? Can you believe it?
I cannot. Hi, everyone. Pronouns she, hers. I cannot believe we are 1 year from when we relaunched the podcast. Well, just 2 days before, but essentially 1 year. Yeah. Like, can you? It's just
Yeah,
shocking to me that time has flown that rapidly.
exactly. And what made us think to start back up right before Thanksgiving? Like, I don't know, but I'm glad we did. I mean,
Yep.
there's
Yep.
never a perfect time, but I'm
Right.
thinking, oh yeah, it was November. So
Yep.
anyway, glad we did and continue to build on those archived episodes that we had. But yeah, it's been a full year. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Incredible. Yeah. So give us our word of the week. I know we did not even have words of the week
We
a year
didn't.
ago, so I don't
Right.
even remember when we started that, but it wasn't a year ago, so dive right in.
Yeah, no, this week we want to define reproductive justice. So, this may be a concept you're familiar with. You may have heard reproductive rights, uh, pro choice, abortion rights, things like that. But we felt like we wanted to share reproductive justice because it is a more encompassing term that was coined in 1994 by the Black Women's Caucus out of Illinois. So, when we talk about access to abortion, it's fairly limited, right? We're just specifically talking about access to that kind of care. Reproductive justice zooms out and says that we all have the right to have access to all these other components of our reproductive healthcare, I guess. And so that includes the right to have children, the right to not have children, the right to raise children in a healthy and safe environment, access to OBGYN care, abortion care, obviously, to be able to be free from reproductive violence and coercion. And it's really a reframing from kind of the pro choice movement to pro access, I guess, because reproductive justice is really about creating opportunities and windows and doors and avenues, whatever path you want to get there, but the access is there. And the other piece that's important for us to think about with reproductive justice vis-a-vis reproductive rights or the pro-choice movement is that reproductive justice engages in applying a political, social, economic, intersectional lens to some of these issues, right? In the ways in which access to reproductive health care is not equitable. So it thinks about that rather than just the choice to be able to choose to access certain care, right? Like if you don't even have access to the care, your choice doesn't ultimately matter, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Yeah,
thought it was
yeah.
a good one to highlight.
Absolutely. Yeah, the access really is a non-issue, or the choice is a non-issue if the access isn't there. That's what you're saying. So yeah, the lack of access has made the choice for you, it sounds like. So
Exactly, exactly.
yeah, I gotcha. I gotcha. Well, that is so um important. It's so timely, given that, we're coming off of the heels of numerous global elections and thinking about who has access to what as a result of all of those elections. So I think that's such a timely conversation to have to broaden what we thought we knew and make it a little more complex. And isn't it interesting how people of color always seem to take something good and put a little more icing on the
Yeah.
good cake, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's not just about pro-choice, which we're also a fan of, but that is limited to the next step. And so I appreciate you bringing up the point of intersectional because oftentimes we start with these concepts and they're not yet. And people of color take them to that place, or LGBT folks take them to that place, which I appreciate.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but let's get into our phase one topic. And so let me tell y'all, I'm gonna come around the corner and down the street on this story really quickly because it's a topic I've been thinking about for a long time, but then a news article just put it front and center to think about self-awareness. Okay, self-awareness. So, Lisa, I know we've spent a lot of time chatting about what we do in individually, whether it's, in our work, in our DEI work, personally, professionally, no matter where we are, we often ask questions of ourselves and each other about how we are moving in the world. And so when you run across people that aren't even close to that planet that we live on, Lisa, that's when it just stands out so poignantly to me. So people's Instagram account posted a story about a former Akron, Ohio police officer who pleaded guilty to multiple charges related to a child sex abuse case. And if that wasn't awful enough by itself, this joker shows up to court with a DILF t-shirt on, DILF. Now, for those of you all who are just pristine and unaware of the filth that can come along with that acronym, the shirt said DILF, and then in smaller print underneath of that acronym, it says devoted, involved, loving father. Now, I don't know about you, Lisa. No. I do know about you. I do know your character. You wouldn't wear that shit to court. You wouldn't wear it probably anywhere. And so with that, I'm like, who does this guy think he is to show up to court based on child sex abuse, which I'm not even getting into those details because that's another podcast. And you're bringing in a sexual reference, and it almost makes me feel, Lisa, like it connects back to the episode or the phase that we did in regards to hiding the truth and hiding the ugliness in the humor. Like, did you think that shit was going to be funny? I, I'm, oof, okay, lost for words on that. And so I appreciate how now I'm going to continue lowering my bar, Dr. Lisa, on my expectations of people to have any form of self-awareness, because I'm sorry, but you and I are clearly cut from a different cloth from this person and lots of other people who have a challenge or even are just completely oblivious to the need to reflect on oneself and how one moves in the world. I'm lost here, Lisa. Help me, because it does not
Yeah.
make sense. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I mean, he's either
Come
for
on.
those of you who don't know what DILF is, just Google it. But it,
That's right. That's right.
it
Google it.
it is he's either lacking, just completely lacking in self awareness, or he is an arrogant, very very arrogant person who thought it would be funny, to your point, or edgy, or contrarian. I don't know, right? And so he decided to wear that t-shirt. So I don't know which one of those that it is, but it reminds me of when Melania Trump, during the height of the child separation at the US southern border, when all of that nasty stuff was happening with kids being removed from their parents as they crossed the border. And then she was photographed getting on a plane or something, and she had this jacket on. And I think the back of the jacket said, "I really don't care, do you?" And so she has since, in her memoir that I haven't read, but I've read reviews of it. She said she had no idea what was going on at the southern border, and so her attire was in no way referencing her lack of care for the child separation policy, right? But so I mean, yeah. So that just, in both of those cases, it just embodies this just absolute flagrant lack of awareness and the ways in which you might be understood by others given the circumstances, right?
Oh, for sure. For sure. Because
Yeah.
okay, so to address your example of Melania, again, here I am trying to be self-aware as I'm examining other people's self-awareness. Lisa, I'm thinking about any first lady wearing the same jacket, how would I also feel, right? And so I'm thinking to myself, as someone who's in the role of first lady, whether you want to be there or not, because we know some of that rumbling around even wanting to be in the traditional role of first lady, first spouse, what have you. The reality is you happen to be married to someone who is supposed to care about everything. So what makes it okay to wear a jacket that says you don't care, even if it's a fashion statement? So, and I love fashion, I love edginess, and I love all of that. But at the very same time, even if she didn't know what was going on in the news, by virtue of the position, same thing with the Akron police officer, by virtue of your position and situation, it's never appropriate. Now, if you're at the house drinking a beer on the couch watching Netflix, then that's your house, that's your space. But you're in court. You're in court. Melania, you were the first lady of this country. Anytime any eyes laid on you, you know that you were being watched. And so, those are now two, and we could probably add many more great examples of lack of self-reflection, unwillingness to think about how you're reflecting on the world, not making any connections between how you show up, how people perceive you, and how they behave towards you. I mean, I don't know. I feel like there's only a certain group of people who constantly flex the privilege of thinking they can do that shit.
Right. Right. It's definitely, I mean, the lack of self awareness is probably bigger for people who have identity privilege, right? Um,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
and I do wonder whether the lack of self awareness comes from an inflated sense of self and the arrogance with that, or whether so like you are an arrogant person who believes that you can do what you want because you've never been corrected and therefore you lack no self-awareness, or whether they're actually distinct, right? Like, so I could be arrogant and self-aware, or I could be not arrogant and not self-aware, right? Like, or does one lead to the other? Like, is it, do people exist who are not arrogant in some way, but lacking in self awareness? Or do they always come together? Does that make sense? Like, I'm just thinking about the connection between those two things.
Well, here's my thing though. I hear you and I love that question. I don't have a great answer, but I want to draw a dotted line around your question
Mm-hmm.
with context.
Yeah.
So, for example, I may be extremely arrogant in one context of my life, which then I let my foot off the gas of self reflection and awareness in that area. But if I'm in another context where I am
Mm.
not as comfortable, not as privileged, my identity is marginalized, and then I reflect on that a bit more. And so I behave differently,
Mm-hmm.
right? So let me give you an example of that. This is, y'all know, one of my favorite podcasts that I listen to all the time is The Pivot, which is three retired football players that interview people of all different walks of life. They started with athletes, but they're all over the place. And so right before the US election, three retired NFL players, Channing Crowder, Fred Taylor, and Ryan Clark, all interviewed President Obama on their podcast, right? Now, usually when they're interviewing other athletes, especially other guys in the league, they will show up in, maybe a statement tee, their sweats, and their favorite sneakers. Or they'll show up with a new lid. They'll show, something that's fashionable, but extremely comfortable for that context with another athlete or with someone that's a friend that they know. President Obama walks onto the interview stage. I think they were in some room somewhere. Obviously, he's got Secret Service around, obviously. All three of these guys, this is the first time that I've seen all three of them together in suits. And it's also very difficult when you're a football player or a former football player, there's never a suit that's off the rack that you can buy. Like nothing fits. So I'm sure it was, obviously expensive, tailored, but you could tell that out of respect for the person in the position, they were self-reflective to make a decision that I'm not showing up to meet a former president in sweatpants and a lid on my head. Just not going to do it. Now, I've seen other situations where this reminds me of my other friend that went to law school and was very dressed up for the interviews and so forth. But the white guys that were coming in the room to try to get into law school had on cargo shorts, a dirty shirt, and sneakers. Right? Well, when you're marginalized in that context, then you may not necessarily be arrogant. And so you have to reflect on how you show up. But if you're the white guy that walks in for the interview for law school, no one's ever told you that you didn't belong. So you're assuming you can wear whatever you want. So, and I know all these examples happen to have the common thread of fashion, but it's expression. It's how you show up, how you choose to show up in certain places and spaces. I would never show up to see someone that I highly respect in, you know, disheveled and having run a comb through my hair, something, right? So I just think it's interesting that I think you're right that there's the pendulum of self-awareness swings based on the context and your marginalization, if at all. But yeah, I'm still struck by this police officer. I'm like, are you kidding? I mean, just
Yeah.
sickening,
Yeah.
sickening.
And it feels arrogant and or also unself-aware, right? Um and I think that
Yeah.
self-awareness is such an interesting concept because it's a constant struggle, right? Because I've been in situations where I've like said things or made mistakes, and then I realize after the fact that, oh, that was kind of stupid. Or, or like misinformed or something, but I didn't have the
Mm,
self awareness in the moment to not say the thing. And then it comes to me
mm,
after the fact.
mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm,
it's just it's an evolution, but I probably wouldn't be wearing any kind of provocative clothing in
mm-hmm.
if I were in trouble for something or I was married to the president of the United States, you know what I mean? So I feel like I might not always
Oh.
get it right, but I feel like I'd get that right.
Well, right, right. And the all I'll say is the last thing that we haven't mentioned thus far is again the lack of sensitivity to whomever and whatever, right? So even like I mentioned before, even if that police officer wears the DILF t-shirt on his couch at home, drinking a beer, watching Netflix, the lack of sensitivity to others in a context that may be harmed by that shirt, that's what I then now have a problem with. Because there's some stuff that I wear at home that no, I probably wouldn't wear out. Why? Because I love it. It's comfortable for me, but also I don't want to be treated a certain way or have an experience of a certain kind if I do wear it elsewhere.
Right, right.
But I've thought that through. Even if for 5 seconds, I still thought it through. How much thinking through did this person have, or Melania have, or whomever have?
I mean,
I
we
don't
don't
know.
know, right? That's why it comes back to
I don't know.
arrogance for me, that arrogance and a lack of self awareness go hand in hand, right? Whether that's context specific or not, it's like it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's the arrogance. I feel like I can't escape that piece of it, that you're
Mm-hmm.
like, you don't even need to be self reflective or be self aware because you're so full of yourself and you're so arrogant. So, what
Mm-hmm.
could you possibly have to think about, right? That's what it feels
Mm-hmm.
like to me. And in this former police officer's case, it really feels like that to me. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
anywho,
Yeah, I don't have to think about the world thinks of how they think of me
yeah,
and how I want to show up because I am going to demand to be treated a certain way.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
All righty then. That's how you can live. That's not how the rest of us can live
Hmm. No,
without
no,
repercussion here.
right.
So, all right. Well, look, that police officer got on my nerves. Next.
Next. Yeah. Well, this might get on your nerves
uh,
too. I don't know. So
uh-oh.
phase two is just something I was thinking about today while I was taking my doggos for a long walk because I was listening to a podcast. I mean, that's not surprising that Lisa was listening to a podcast. But it was a BBC, right? So the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, that has a pretty good reputation globally around its reporting, and I think probably it's most akin to PBS here in the US. And it was a series related to conspiracy theories and the rise of anti-democratic sentiment in the United States. So it was a British reporter and a producer of the show, and they spent some time in the US. They did a lot of interviews. But what struck me from listening to this was there was a degree of nuance that they missed, right? And I've been thinking about this for some time because my niece is doing in the UK you do these things called A levels that you do from 16 to 18 years old, and then that gets you into university. So you don't like graduate high school. And she's taking a political science A level, which is also what I did. But she's learning about the US political system. And so she'll ask me some questions or she'll tell me what her teacher said. And I'm like, that's not exactly right, right? It doesn't entirely work that way. And for me, those pieces, that kind of minutia or the nuance or the context didn't really land on me until I'd lived in the United States, despite the fact that all my education, undergrad and graduate, was about US political science, right? In the United Kingdom. And I didn't really get it until I came here. I mean, there was just huge gaps in my knowledge, right? So back to this podcast. So you have these British journalists who are doing this whole show that British people are consuming, and they're telling the story of January 6th conspiracy and all of that. But it's not accurate. It's not 100% accurate. So it's misleading in many ways. So that made me think about, what does it mean when you have a group of people or a person who is not a part of the thing that they're talking about? So, like, as a white person, if I am talking about the experience of being a black woman in the United States, right? Or in this case, the BBC people talking about this kind of cultural stuff that they are not a part of and how that can be problematic. We talk about being an ally, we talk about being an advocate for groups of which you are not a part, and that's important. But my question to you, Shaunna, is at what point can that tip over into misinformation, misleading, because you miss those nuanced pieces that are really important to part of the story. Does that make sense what I'm asking you? Like, it just made me really think about the problems that could arise when you're not part of that group, you're not part of that culture. And yeah, there's just stuff that you won't know unless you're fully immersed in that place, which in some cases could never happen, right? When we're talking about identities.
That's right.
But
That's right.
yeah.
That's right. Yeah. No, I got you. No, it's such a great point, right? Because I feel like for allyship purposes, it's like walking right up to the edge, but not going over a line, right? So I would feel extremely comfortable, for example, and I'll give an example that I've heard Dr. Lisa say more than once about groups that she was not a part of, right? So, for example, let's say you did go with that example of, I am speaking to the experience of, let's say, Black women in corporate or professional settings, and let's say you're rattling off some details, some data, some whatever that you're aware of. But I've always heard you couch that in the language of, this is what I'm aware of, although I will never be able to speak to it fully. Right. So I think what is unfortunate is that allies step all the way into the shoes of someone else that don't fit them, versus pointing to the shoes and then making space and place and ability for those in those shoes to then speak, right? So you went up to the line, but you didn't go over the line, right? And I found myself having to do things similarly, given that my research was with LGBT communities, of which I'm not a part, but still speaking up to the line when I have opportunity. And there may be other folks around me that either are not part of the LGBT community, are not knowledgeable about the LGBT community, not self-aware, or closeted, right? So going right up to that line, but also couching that in the language of, I will never be able to fully speak to the experiences of this group in ways that deserve it. So let me give you what I know, but stop there. So it takes that know-it-all piece off of it, because I've experienced, especially when it comes to feminism, and a number of other white co-opted approaches to the lived experience. It's like, you're speaking for you. Like, I still have friends that still don't fully understand, for example, the women's suffrage movement, and 1920 was for some and not all. So going back to your point around nuance, if your niece is learning about the women's suffrage movement, depending on how it's taught, your niece may think, oh, that means all American women. Well, that's a huge nuance to miss, that it was not for all women, but it was for white women specifically until Civil Rights Act, da da da, going on down the legislation. And so, to me, I think, let's go back to our self-awareness and self-reflection. As you attempt to imperfectly demonstrate allyship characteristics for groups, us included, you and me, Lisa, are we overstepping our boundaries speaking for, or are we staying in the most appropriate realm or of speaking in support of and making space for amplification of other voices? If we're stomping all over that line, then we're missing the point. And in fact, it might turn
Yeah.
people off when it comes to supporting them rather than being one that's helpful, a helpful voice.
Yeah, and it's also this lens through which we decipher information, right? So, in the case of this BBC podcast, they're taking information they've gleaned from interviews and other research, and then it's filtered through their British lens out to a British audience. And so, in so doing, they lose something. And so I think about that too. Like, you tell me about an experience of racism or misogynoir that you've experienced. And then if I want to share that with your permission to someone else to prove a point, right? Like, I'm still filtering your story through Lisa's kind of white UK, now US, like, lens. And so how do I not apply an interpretation to that distorts the original experience, right? Even though that might be happening unconsciously.
I'm not even sure you can do that though, Lisa. Like,
Mm.
you remember when, it's been several episodes ago, where we talked about using, generally using race to describe someone, right? Not from a slur point of view, but white to describe an individual, right? Remember we talked about that. Well, a white individual describing another white individual is not going to land the same way as an African American describing a white person, with even whether it's tone inflection, whether it's whatever emoting that comes behind that word or phrase, because there's a whole lot of history that comes out through a little bit more bass in my voice that then will come out of another white person's voice, based on the lived experience of engaging in certain ways with that word and the individuals that are represented by that word. And so I'm not even sure if it's possible, Lisa, because there's going to be some things that are, I don't even want to say filtered out, because I feel like filter is intentional. Like, I'm intentionally leaving something out versus I literally don't have the ability or the range to speak to it. Right. So it would be like you and me trying to go out here and be like Mariah Carey, where we have like 8 octaves of voice of identity. It is literally not possible for us. We might have 1 or 2, not 8. Right. And so we don't have those octaves of understanding for other groups, and we might never, like, even when we think about secondhand identities. So let's say you're the parent or sibling of an LGBT person, or you're the spouse or the loved one of a neurodivergent person. Yes, you can speak to, again, the octaves. You can speak to it a degree more than most people, but you can't still speak to it fully, right? And so, again, that's inviting nuance into. I need to go read the article that you're presenting here, Lisa, because I'm wondering if the problem is lack of nuance rather
Mm-hmm.
than, because my fear, Lisa, is, people are going to go into extremes. They'll be like, okay, well, I'm not going to speak for anybody. Forget
Right,
allyship.
right.
I'm not going to do it. That's not what we're saying. But what we are
Mm-mm.
saying is, with self-reflection and self-assessment of how we're speaking of groups, are we reminding ourselves that we can only speak to a certain point? We only have a
Right.
certain range to speak of, but we literally can. So, when I've heard this before by what very well-meaning people that said, well, Shaunna, I'm trying to understand your situation. And I'm not trying to be mean or cut them, but I am speaking to this very point. I would never ask a non-black, non-female, non, someone that's all of the
Mm-hmm.
other identities from what I identify as. I would never expect them to understand my experience.
Right.
Maybe be aware of it, maybe be knowledgeable about it, but to truly understand it, that's literally not possible for you. Just like it's
Mm-hmm.
not possible for me to understand what it feels like to be a white woman or to be anything else. And so there is a point to which we can understand, but do we have enough cultural humility to stop at that line rather than just charge right over it? I don't know.
Yeah, no, this is a great conversation. I can't remember if we mentioned the name of the article. You and I talked about it before we started recording, but it's Linda Alcoff. She's a professor, and it's called The Problem of Speaking for Others. And she published this article back in the 90s, and I've used it heavily because you have elected representatives who are speaking for you, right? They have a mandate because they're elected, but that's just one manifestation of this. But there are these other ways, and it just made me think about it. So I think there's a lot here to think about, but I want to underscore what you said about it's not that we're saying you can't be an ally and you can't speak for or about, right? That's not it. It's just, I guess there's the nuance piece. There's a line that you need to stop at, and how do you decipher that? I think is where it gets complicated.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And not even attempting to be perfect about the line, but just to be aware that there is a line, and you make very conscious, even if you make mistakes, when you make mistakes, just be conscious about, am I willing to step closer to that line in the hopes of doing the right
Mm-hmm.
thing?
Mm-hmm.
Or do I need to step back and make space for other people? Just being very conscious that
Right.
there is a line, and what in the world to do about it is the point here, I think. But I got to go read
Yeah.
this article. It
Yep.
sounds
Yeah.
incredible, actually. So,
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good one. I think it's enduring in terms of its premise.
mhm.
All
Yeah.
right. So let's move on to phase 3 here. So another podcast that Lisa was listening to has prompted this particular piece, and it's connected to our definition, our concept of reproductive justice. So, as our listeners will know, there has been a lot of discussion around, in particular, access to abortion care, and many states had ballot measures this election cycle to enshrine rights to that care within their constitutions, or trying to defeat constitutional amendments that would prohibit that. And one of the things that's been most frustrating for me is these discussions of quote unquote late term abortions, and in some cases, abortion after birth, which is like not a thing, just to be clear, right? Like if you kill a child after they have been born, that is infanticide, and that is illegal in all of the states, right? But the way that it's been discussed is so cruel, right? Because it just lacks any knowledge of the pain and difficulty the experience is for families who have a child who are pregnant, and that child is not going to live, right? And so they either make a decision to have an abortion prior to that child's birth, or they do what is known as perinatal hospice or palliative care. And this is what the podcast was about. And I just wanted to talk about it with you, Shaunna, because it was so, one, I learned a ton, but two, it really brought home to me the simplification of these complex issues that we see in the news and with political candidates, which I know we've talked about before. But essentially, what perinatal hospice care is you are pregnant with a child. You learn that that child has something that is going to mean that they will not live very long, right? But you decide that you would like to give birth to the child, and you set out a plan that in that 30 to 60 to 75 minutes that the kiddo is alive, you are doing palliative care, creating a comfortable space, introducing the child to family members, any religious or spiritual practices or favorite music or, any number of things. But you're planning while you're still pregnant for this so that at the point that you give birth, there is this whole thing that plays out so that you can grieve and say goodbye to your child in a beautiful and loving way, right? Because this is the worst day of your life, probably. All of that is nowhere to be found in the discussions and the commentary that we hear from politicians and people who just repeat and parrot that information without doing the research. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are, Shaunna, and your knowledge of the ways in which this particular issue gets flattened to the point where we just have this dearth of understanding about what it means to make these horrible, horrible decisions related to providing hospice care to your 30-minute-old child that is not going to live much longer. So
Yeah. Well, I think what's really important to think about is, again, isn't it interesting how we depersonalize something that's so very personal? That's the first thing I'm thinking of. But then the second thing is, again, the nuance. You brought up doing a little bit of research on this and finding out more than just sound bites. And the reality is, if you ask 10 different families about even one birth story in their family, you're probably going to get 15 to 20 different stories, because you're going to have all these births with different perspectives, and how it played out for them personally. Now, we've already dispelled the myth of abortions after birth, so we're not going there. And at the same time, I do think, Lisa, we have a very hard time grappling with, now I think we've gotten closer to it, but we have a hard time grappling with grief and bereavement to begin with. I'm thinking about one of our clients that recently updated their workplace policy on bereavement to now include families who lost a child, which includes families who lost an infant. Lo and behold, as soon as the ink was dry on the bereavement policy, they had a staff member who lost an infant within the first week. It wasn't within that hour window, obviously. Everything is quite nuanced, but was in the first 7 days. And so the policy could apply, even in such a grim, dire situation. Well, I feel like, to be completely callous about the whole thing, I feel like we put much more grief on people out of the ignorance of not being there and doing that, right? So every time I read one of these lies, these outright disinformation campaigns, as I read it, I'm looking at it like, everybody that crafted every single word of this has never even been through this situation, has no proximity to the situation, right? I've shared before on this podcast the birth story of both of my sons, but with Kendrick in particular, my youngest, who's 10, well, there's no worse feeling than having a child, no worse feeling in my life. Let me speak for me, being self-reflected. There's no worse experience than all the buildup to hopefully having a child for those of us who wanted to have a family, all the buildup of having a child only to go to the hospital, go through the entire medical and emotional and psychological process of having a child, and then not walking out of the hospital with said child, right? When Kendrick was born, because of his dire situation, but we still call him the heavyweight because he was a heavy preemie. He was 5 pounds on the dot. But he had to be airlifted from the hospital he was born in to a more equipped children's hospital in DC, airlifting. Well, that meant that when I left the hospital to go home, to rest, to gather myself, to go visit him in the children's hospital, I had to leave without a baby. No parent imagines leaving a hospital where people give birth without said baby, right? And so just the emotion around that piece. Now, fortunately, he was doing much better at that time, but it still did not feel good. It didn't feel as one would imagine and one expects. And so, given that, to flatly assume that I don't know what people are thinking they're doing with babies that don't live very long. I mean, what do you think they're doing with them? There is a note of respect and awe and gratefulness, and just think about all the emotions around the emotional wheel that one feels, the gratefulness of their birth, but also feeling robbed for the lack of life. There's so many different things that come up, because this is reminding me of a lot of pastoral care stuff from seminary that people just don't remember or don't highlight need to be processed by the family. And so the assumption that there's just a cut and dry situation where a kid is just, for lack of a better term, do you think they're throwing babies in the trash? No. There are people that are trained from a medical perspective, from a psychological perspective, from a social work perspective, from a theological or faith system perspective, to support and wrap around the family. Now, lots of people don't know that. Lots of people wouldn't even assume that. But isn't it interesting, Lisa, how we in very gruesome ways glamorize everything? We blow things out of proportion because we're making an assumption that things happen in a way that they really don't. That's not even fair to the families. And I appreciate that we're having this discussion, and hopefully as allies in our own way here, because it's re-traumatizing the family to even educate people that there are folks to wrap around and support them. And so they shouldn't have to do that. They're grieving a child, or they're processing the loss of a child. So given that, it's a shame that everything has to be glamorized in such a way that, oh, let's create the shock and awe of throwing babies in trash cans to make people think that we shouldn't do XYZ at all and add the nuance to it. The lack of education, the lack of information that you're bringing up around not doing a little bit of research, lack of information creates a great opportunity to flagrantly use people at their lowest points. And that is not okay. It's not okay at all.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just, I mean, obviously I'm not a parent, right? But I listened to this podcast and it just made me cry because they interviewed a woman who talked about her experience and the decision that she
Mm,
made to give birth to her
hmm.
child and kind of what that palliative care looked like in the hour that her
Yeah,
child lived.
yeah.
And I mean, it was obviously just heartbreaking, just generally, right? But it was just doubly heartbreaking because you think about the way
Hmm.
that scenario has been broken apart and then spread
Hmm.
incorrectly without any of the care or concern or compassion for the devastation that she and other people similarly situated would be feeling.
Yeah, yeah,
And it just the
that's
cruelty,
right.
and that Adam Serwer from The Atlantic wrote a piece several years ago called The Cruelty is the Point. And I always
Yes, yes,
remember
yes.
that, right? Because in this case, that's what really landed on me. So these narratives that get pushed out about afterbirth abortion just ludicrous of it, right? But they're cruel. There's a cruelty to that. And then if you, as a consumer of that nonsense, don't do due diligence to better understand, like how, like, and you're not understanding it, and then you're kind of
Mm,
articulating this message of save the babies, right? Like, how could you do that to a child, which is like not even correct, but you're not even taking the time to understand the nature of that decision and what it means to say goodbye to your kiddo that you thought you'd be, well, you would, well, in these cases, you know, well ahead of time that you're not going to be walking out of the hospital with your child, but it's still obviously devastating, right? So I don't know. I just, it really landed on me in such a really powerful way, because the podcast itself was trying to do what we're doing here, is to dispel that myth and
yes.
explain what this is.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like, I've talked to you, Shaunna, about how not everyone has the time to do the research and understand some of these
Yeah.
complex issues, while at the same time, I am maddened, deeply maddened by people who refuse to do the research and understand this issue specifically, you
Well,
know?
look, I'm okay. I think we're going to speak to two sides of the same coin. Absolutely. I feel like people should dig around a little bit more and uh not take a sound bite as the full truth. That's one piece of it. And on the other hand, I'm I am a big uh advocate of reminding people to not lie by omission, right? Meaning that you're telling some of it, but you're not telling all of it, which would then change the entire construct of the information, right? So I've used this example before. My old boss used to use it all the time, where he used to say, it's one thing if you if something's on fire in the backyard and saying it's a barbecue versus the house is on fire, right? And so you got to give context, you got to give full information. And I think that is inherently the challenge is that the result of giving incomplete information is, in my opinion, a lie by omission. So incomplete information turns into exploiting the cruelty to manipulate people to make decisions that you want them to make. So, Lisa, if I want to manipulate you to bring food over to the grill tomorrow, then I'll say there's a fire out back. I didn't say my house was on fire. The truth is my house is on fire, but I need food for after the fire. I just manipulated you, Lisa, by telling you half the truth. That's what I feel like happens all the time in the US, going back to, where was it, Finland, that has the truth campaign that they're teaching with kids. I feel like almost every, which is why I did my best to turn off the news and not watch too much leading up to the election, was that I felt like I was allowing myself to be manipulated by hearing half truths, half stories, soundbite here, soundbite there. And I was like, not only am I just exhausted by it because it's been just a long time coming, but I feel like I'm allowing you to manipulate me, candidates or whomever, by continuing to turn on the TV when I can just turn it off. And so now I have to control how much I allow you to traumatize me, cutting that shit off. And it was hard
Right.
because I like to be
Yeah.
informed and I love this information and there
Yeah.
are voices that I trust. But
Yeah.
at some point, I had to make some conscious efforts to say, I'm overwhelmed by the information, the sound
Mm-hmm.
bites. I don't have enough time to review every topic. I reviewed the ones that are most important to me, but there's a lot of shit that's important to me.
Yeah.
Won't get to everything. So now I have to control your ability to think that you're manipulating me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was hard. It's still hard.
Yeah.
Even, it's still hard. It's going to be hard forever, but because I enjoy information. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, Yeah,
Ugh.
not to end this show on a downer, but we'll include the link to this perinatal palliative hospice care podcast. If
Yes.
for those of you who are interested in just being more educated and kind of understanding the depth of the issue, I do think it's important to know more about,
Hmm.
and just to know that it exists. Right? Should you find yourself in that situation, or have a family member or a friend or something who doesn't know about it, right? That this is possible.
Hmm.
So anyway,
Yeah, absolutely.
so, with that, Shaunna, let's wrap it up. Where can folks find us on the interwebs?
Yes, find us, please. So find us on our YouTube channel, Unfazed, Unedited. Also find us at Apple Podcasts. Subscribe there. Make sure you subscribe. Spotify, you can also subscribe there as well, and the new episode just pops up for you every week. You can find us on Instagram at Unfazed Pod, LinkedIn at Unfazed Pod, or you can email us at info@unfazedpod.com. Our website has all the episodes over actually further back than just a year. Even though this is our anniversary, it actually goes further back into the archives. So go to unfazedpodcast.com to find those old and new shows. But if you like this week's episode, please like, subscribe, leave a review. Let us know what you thought, maybe even what you want to hear, and share with your friends, coworkers, or others in this phase of your life. So, Lisa, until next week.
Until next week.